They told you the past was simple, fact and dates, stories in dusty books. But history isn't written in ink, it's carved in fear, in the shadows of streets long forgotten, where innocence was traded for silence and the powerful fed on the weak. Tonight I'll show you what they buried, what they never meant for you to know. This isn't just the story of a child, it's the unveiling of a system, rot beneath respectability. It begins in Berlin, 1904, a city buzzing with industrial might, electric streetcars and stock markets, but behind that facade, filth festered in the alleys, in tenement stairwells where secrets screamed behind closed doors. Lucie Berlin was 9 years old, bright, polite, a small light in a dark world. Her father, a weary cigar maker. Her mother, a ghost of exhaustion. They lived at 130 Aosta, a street known to authorities but ignored by politicians, a place where you could vanish in daylight and no one asked questions. On the morning of June 9th, Lucie followed her usual routine: school, home, help prepare lunch. Her father came home, ate and left for work again. Normal, mundane. That's how evil prefers it. Around 1 p.m., Lucie asked for the key to the communal toilet upstairs. Her mother handed it over with a warning. Don't linger, don't talk. And Lucie, ever obedient, disappeared up the stairs. She never came back. Within minutes, panic set in. Her mother checked the toilet. It was locked. Silence. Her brother joined the search, calling for Lucie through the building, down the crowded street, through the filth and noise of a city that didn't care. Neighbors joined, some curious, some complicit. And time bled. Every minute lost, every voice unanswered. You feel it, don't you? That shift, the chill crawling down your spine? That's the moment it stops being a story. That's the moment you realize something ancient and terrible watches from the dark corner. Of power, feeding off what we refuse to see. Lucie wasn't the first child to vanish on Aosta Street, and she wouldn't be the last. What happened next will pull you deep, beyond crime, beyond corruption, into a world. As the hours stretched into the evening, the quiet dread that gripped Lucie's mother became an unbearable storm. When Frederick Berlin returned from his shift, his wife was barely standing, her voice hoarse from calling into voids that offered no answer. Together they scoured the neighborhood, doorways, alleyways, faces, each one a possible witness, a possible monster. They went to the police, who listened with weary detachment. Another missing child from Aosta. Just another file. But Frederick's desperation forced their hand. A description was issued: a dark brown dress, black apron, white stockings, and striking red ankle boots, the kind no one forgets. Around her neck, a gold medallion, a family keepsake. That detail, the gold medallion, would haunt this investigation like a whisper from beyond. The police fanned out, questions were asked, doors knocked. But Aosta Street doesn't speak. Its residents live between fear and survival. Some said they'd seen her with other girls. Perhaps, they mused, she wandered off. But her mother knew. Lucie never wandered. Obedience had been beaten into her by poverty and love alike. Others spoke of a man, limping, bearded, in a straw hat, ill-fitting clothes, holding a child's hand. Seen near Humboldt Park, an area of shadows and isolation, the kind of place predators know, the kind of place authorities avoid. As night choked the city, Berlin's darker heart came alive. Prostitutes leaned in doorways, drifters roamed, pimps watched from windows. And Lucie, the little girl with the red boots, was now a ghost in the city's filth. Newspapers caught the scent of blood. Headlines screamed abduction. The community panicked. But behind the chaos, something else stirred. Power. The power to control the narrative, to bury the truth beneath spectacle. The police increased their presence not to protect but to manage, to make sure what happened in Aosta didn't spill over into polite society. But Lucie's story couldn't be contained. The witness accounts grew, a pattern formed: the limping man, the child, the park. He wasn't a myth, he was real, and someone knew who he was, someone close, someone watching. You see, this wasn't just a random act, it was systemic, organized, hidden behind the filth in the machinery of control. You're not just watching a mystery unfold. You're watching a system tighten its grip on truth, on fear, on the very idea of justice. Lucie's fate wasn't unique. It was inevitable in a world ruled by those who... June 11th, 1904. 2 days since Lucie vanished. The city is restless, simmering with unease. Whispers curl through alleyways across tenement walls. And then it happens. A fisherman working near the Viadama Bridge notices something floating in the Spree River, a bundle wrapped in blood-stained paper. The river, ancient and indifferent, gives up its secret. He pulls it to shore, opens it, and horror spills into daylight. Inside is the torso of a young girl, severed crudely, carelessly. The fisherman recoils, but he knows what he must do. He alerts the police, and suddenly, everything accelerates. Law enforcement rushes to the scene, drawn by dread and the need to be seen doing something. They examine the body. Clothing remnants match the description of Lucie Berlin, but they need confirmation, and they want it fast. They bring Frederick Berlin to the morgue. Imagine that moment, staring at what's left of your child, stripped of innocence and identity, reduced to fragments. Frederick's eyes fall on a scar beneath the chest. He knows it, a tiny familiar wound from a fall long ago. It is her. There's no longer hope, only truth. Cold, bloody, unforgiving. The press erupts. The city reels. Fear becomes rage, but rage is a weapon, and someone is holding it, directing it, controlling where it lands. You see, chaos benefits power, and in the noise, real questions get drowned. Who did this, and why? Enter Dr. Fritz Strassmann, a renowned forensic expert. His autopsy reveals more than death. It reveals violation. Lucie had been assaulted, strangled, dismembered post-mortem by someone clumsy, untrained, not a surgeon, not a butcher, just a monster hiding among the ordinary. But there's something worse, a sense that this was not impulse but pattern. Lucie wasn't just murdered. She was processed, discarded, and almost erased. Almost. Because her story fights back. Dr. Strassmann's findings hake the public. And behind closed doors, those in power begin to worry, not about justice, but about exposure. The streets of Berlin hold many secrets. Some of them walk upright in daylight, dressed in respectability, speaking of order and morality. But when night falls, they reveal their true faces. You're beginning to see, aren't you? This is about more than Lucie. This is about control, and what happens when the weak dare to exist beneath the gaze of the powerful. Keep watching. As dawn breaks on June 12th, Berlin is no longer just a city. It's a crime scene soaked in fear and suspicion. The police tighten their grip on Oster Street, probing every shadow, interrogating the broken, the desperate, the silent. But the truth doesn't live in official reports. It lurks in the filth, in the spaces between lies. Theories swirl. Then a name surfaces. Johanna Liut, a prostitute. Known, watched, discarded. She lived on the same floor as Lucie Berlin. In a city built on hierarchies of power and shame, Johanna was invisible, until now. Police question her. She says little, but something catches their attention. On the morning of June 11th, just hours before Lucie's remains surfaced, Johanna had been released from a 3-day detention for insulting a client. And after her release, she received a visitor, Theodor Berber. He told someone in the stairwell he was a second-hand goods dealer. But it was a lie. The web tightens. Johanna, when asked about Berber, denies knowing a dealer. She mentions a different man, Otto Lent, an old associate, another lie. The police smell blood, and it's not from the river. They track down Otto Lent and arrest him. For a moment it seems the case is solved, but Otto unexpectedly has an alibi, verified by an insurance agent. He was elsewhere when Lucie died. The case twists. The lie is exposed. Otto is innocent. Theodor Berber, he is the constant, not a dealer, not a stranger. He's Johanna's partner, not by love, but by force. Her pimp, a man steeped in violence, theft, and control. His criminal history reads like a confession: public disturbances, grievous harm, manipulation. The kind of man who thrives in the system's blind spots. Now witnesses emerge. Neighbors recall seeing Berber near the Berlin family's apartment when Lucie vanished. His behavior, erratic, suspicious. The pieces begin to connect: Berber's proximity, his lies, his past. He becomes the eye of the storm. And just then a fisherman again pulls something from the spray. Not paper, not cloth, but flesh. A child's head, arms. It is Lucie. Whole now in death, mutilated, tossed, forgotten. Until now. Berber and Johanna are arrested. The facade crumbles. The system trembles. Because Berber is not an anomaly. He is a symptom. A creation of corruption, of abandonment, of power turned inward. This isn't justice. This is containment. Watch closely. They took Theodore Berber into custody, a man now stripped of lies, yet cloaked in arrogance. He insisted on innocence, declaring he'd slept through the day of Lucie's disappearance, nestled safely in Johanna's apartment. But his words were brittle, full of cracks. The investigators leaned in, pressing harder. Then Johanna, tired of the shadow games, offered a detail, one that twisted the blade of suspicion. Upon returning home after her release, she noticed something missing: a small white travel basket. She confronted Berber. His answer? He claimed he'd gotten drunk, brought a woman home, and when he couldn't pay for her services, he gave her the basket. Convenient, hollow. When asked for her name, her description, even a trace of this phantom woman, Berber had none. His silence spoke louder than words, and the darkness around Lucie's fate thickened. The police now had a shape to the puzzle. That basket wasn't just a household item, it was a vessel of horror, and they weren't the only ones thinking that. The press exploded with theories. The basket became an icon of dread, a symbol of innocence defiled and disposed. Then, as if summoned by fate, a boatman walked into a local police station with a revelation. He hadn't followed the news, hadn't known of Lucie, but on June 11th, the same day Lucie's torso was found, he retrieved a basket from the spray just above the Kronprinzen Bridge. It matched the police description, a chilling synchronicity. The basket was examined, stuck to its sides, scraps of blood-stained wrapping paper, the same kind found with Lucie's remains. Johanna identified it as hers. The net tightened. Forensic analysis uncovered traces of blood and wool fibers within the basket's weave. The blood was human. The wool, a perfect match to Lucie's clothing. The evidence no longer whispered, it screamed. The system could no longer hide behind doubt. Theodore Berber stood exposed, not just as a man, but as a manifestation of rot. A man shaped by a society that breeds monsters in the margins and then acts shocked when they surface. He was charged with Lucie's murder. But here's what they won't tell you. Justice wasn't their goal. Control was. Berber was useful. A scapegoat, a way to sew up a narrative before deeper truths leaked out. Because Lucie's story isn't singular, it's systemic, and the system feeds on silence. Keep watching. July 31st, 1904, Lucie Berlin's funeral. The city held its breath as nearly 1,000 mourners gathered in front of the mortuary, hours before the procession began. They came not only to grieve, but to stare into the abyss that had swallowed this child, a glimpse into the broken soul of Berlin itself. As the open hearse wound through the streets, led by a solemn marching band, the crowd swelled. People poured from homes, businesses, alleyways, silent, watching, processing. In those faces, something ancient stirred, not just sorrow but a collective reckoning. The city had failed this child, but who among them dared admit that? The procession moved like a river of grief, flowing toward St. Elizabeth's Cemetery. Along the route, men removed hats, women wept openly, children clung to their mothers. As the gates opened, the crowd pressed closer, desperate to witness, to understand, to somehow anchor themselves to a reality that now felt unreal. This was not just a burial, it was an indictment. Newspapers captured every detail, their ink dripping with emotion, but also with something else: fear. Because Lucie's death had broken through the illusion that safety could be bought, that monsters only lurked in shadows. No, they wore familiar faces. They lived in your building, ate at your table, controlled your streets. The press needed a villain, and they had one: Theodore Berber. But they also needed to close the wound before it festered further. The trial date was set: December 12, 1904. Public interest surged again. Nearly 1,000 witnesses were called. The court swelled with people, breathless, obsessed. Among them, Lucie's mother. When she testified, her words cut deeper than any knife. She recounted her final conversation with Lucie, warning her daughter never to go with strangers. Lucie had laughed, confident. "I'm not stupid, Mother," she said. "No one will cut off my head and throw it into the water." Her words became prophecy. In the courtroom, gasps broke the silence. Theodore Berber, now cornered, dared to compare himself to Christ, facing judgment, standing before Pilate. The arrogance, the blasphemy, it ignited fury. But rage is easy. Truth is harder. The trial was more than justice. It was spectacle, a performance designed to satisfy public hunger while concealing deeper rot. As witnesses spoke, as evidence was laid bare, something became clear. This crime was not a random act of depravity. It was part of a pattern, a dark current running beneath society, one that surfaces only when power loses its grip. You feel it now, don't you? That chill. The trial of Theodore Berber gripped Berlin like a fever dream, each day a descent into something darker. Spectators filled the courtroom, not for justice but for revelation. They wanted to see the monster, to stare into his eyes and ask, why? But Berber didn't flinch. He stood there, defiant, cloaking himself in martyrdom, claiming innocence with a smirk that reeked of contempt. The prosecution's evidence was damning. Dr. Schultz took the stand, explaining how the wool fibers in Lucie's clothing were identical to those found inside the travel basket, Johanna's basket, the very one that carried Lucie's dismembered body through the city's veins of water. The blood found inside? Human. Proven. There was no escape. No alternative explanation. Berber's world collapsed one fiber at a time. But the defense clawed at doubt, summoning their own experts. They argued the basket could belong to anyone, that the blood tests, though new, weren't absolute. They pointed to a chilling absence. No blood had been found in Johanna's apartment, no trace of Lucie, no weapon. No witness had seen Berber with the girl. It was, they claimed, circumstantial, a theory, a shadow hunt, but even shadows leave trails. The court listened, rapt, as expert Augustus Wasson confirmed the blood was indeed human. He added something more, a detail that shifted everything. Lucie had not been strangled. She had been suffocated, perhaps with a pillow or by someone's hands silencing her forever. This wasn't just murder. It was intimate, controlled, deliberate. The defense recoiled, desperate to blur the lines. They insisted Berber was merely convenient, chosen by a desperate police force eager to close the case, to pacify a city on the edge. They whispered that the prosecution's story was built on air, but the jury had heard enough. The evidence may have been incomplete, but the pattern was undeniable. The lies, the inconsistencies, the basket, the fibers, the proximity, the past. The deliberation was swift. The verdict, manslaughter, not murder, a calculated compromise. 15 years in prison, with 10 more under surveillance. But you see it now, don't you? This wasn't about Berber. He was a symptom, not a cause. Lucie's death wasn't an isolated crime. It was a fracture in the facade, a glimpse at how power protects itself, how systems choose silence over truth. If you're still watching, write it below, twice. I see the pattern. Theodore Berber was led from the courtroom in chains, but what truly bound him wasn't iron. It was the knowledge that he had become a symbol, a vessel into which an entire city poured its fear, its guilt, and its need for closure. 15 years in a prison cell, 10 more under the cold gaze of state supervision. But was justice truly served, or was something far more sinister accomplished? Ask yourself, who really won? Lucie Berlin's name faded from headlines, replaced by fresher scandals and distractions. But for those paying attention, the trial's outcome was the final clue in a riddle too dangerous for the average man to solve. You see, Berber's sentencing wasn't about truth. It was about containment. The evidence, while substantial, was never absolute. No one saw him commit the crime. No weapon was found. No blood in the apartment. Only fibers, whispers, and a basket. But he fit the profile. A criminal past, a violent temper, a man society could discard without disrupting the order. And that's the key. The system didn't pursue truth. It pursued equilibrium. Lucie's murder threatened that balance. Her death was a rupture in the social order, a reminder that evil walks among us, often dressed as familiarity. The elites couldn't allow that fear to grow unchecked, couldn't allow the people to believe they were truly vulnerable, so they fed them a narrative neat and digestible. Berber was the monster, the system, the savior. But look deeper and you'll see. The very institutions claiming to protect Lucie had failed her at every turn. Her tenement building, a breeding ground for vice. The police, slow to act, desperate to conclude. The media, sensationalizing tragedy for profit. And behind it all, a hidden network of influence that ensured no questions were asked about the environment that allowed this horror to unfold. They didn't just bury Lucie, they buried the truth with the crowd that mourned at her funeral, the jury that judged Berber, the press that cried for justice. They were all part of a ritual, a performance to restore order. You were never supposed to notice, but you did. And now that you do, you begin to understand. This was not just a crime, it was a message, one of control, manipulation, and the cold machinery of power that You've seen the surface. Now step beneath it, into the cold, calculated world where crimes like Lucie Berlin's murder are not merely tragedies but tools. Tools to reinforce systems, to remind the public who holds dominion over truth and justice. After Berber's sentencing, Berlin exhaled in collective relief, but that relief was engineered. It was curated by those who understand a simple law. Fear is power, and controlling the narrative means controlling the people. Let's trace the shadows, because Lucie's death was not an isolated incident. In early 20th century Berlin, disappearances of children from poor districts were not rare. They were simply unreported, lost in the fog of overcrowded tenements and systemic neglect. Lucie was different only because her story caught attention. The press seized it. Politicians postured, police flexed, but not to protect, no, to pacify. Lucie's name became a banner under which the system could prove its strength. But what if that strength was always hollow? The travel basket, the fibers, the blood, all real, but insufficient to explain the deeper horror. How could a man with no confirmed alibi, no evidence tying him directly to Lucie's final moments, be condemned so swiftly? Because he was chosen. Berber's profile, his record, his proximity, his poverty, made him disposable. Sacrifice him, and the machine keeps turning. Let him walk free, and people begin to ask real questions. Questions about how a society so advanced allowed a little girl to vanish in broad daylight. About how a city of industry and intellect still harbored slums infested with vice and danger. About how the powerful never lived in places where Lucie played. The trial silenced those questions. It restored the illusion of order, but the deeper truth is this: the system needs chaos, needs tragedy, because from chaos it extracts control. The people cry for safety and the state answers, but the price is always obedience, always blindness. Berber was guilty, but perhaps not of murder. He was guilty of being expendable. And Lucie? She was guilty of being born into a world where innocence has no defense against the grindstone of power. This is not a story about a killer. It's a story about how history is written by those who need to hide the rot beneath civilization's polished mask. Lucie Berlin was lost to darkness, but her story is a light they couldn't fully. Now that you see the rot beneath the surface, understand this. Lucie's story is not just a relic of history, it's a template, a blueprint for how control is maintained through selective justice and orchestrated fear. After the trial, life resumed in Berlin. But for whom? The poor still suffered in silence, in the same dark alleys where Lucie's laughter once echoed. The press, once rabid with stories, moved on to the next spectacle. The politicians who demanded action disappeared behind polished doors, content that the masses had been appeased. But for Lucie's family, there was no closure, only the hollow echo of a world that used their grief to maintain order. And what of Theodore Berber? He became a cautionary tale, a name whispered with contempt or fear. Yet behind bars he was no longer a man, he was a symbol of how the system deals with threats to its illusion of safety. Not by eradicating the root causes, poverty, neglect, corruption, but by sacrificing pawns to preserve the image. And here lies the most sinister truth. Lucie's death was a currency. Her body, broken and discarded, became a transaction between the state and its people, a promise that justice was served, that order prevailed. But it was a lie, because the system didn't change. The tenements remained disease-ridden. The poor still vanished in the night, and the institutions, the police, the courts, the press, continued to serve not truth but stability. Stability for whom? For those in power, for those who ensure that tragedy becomes routine, that horror becomes spectacle, that questions are never asked too loudly. Look around today. How many Lucies are forgotten? How many names go unspoken, buried beneath the same rituals? Public outrage, convenient arrests, and then silence. The pattern persists because it works, because the machine feeds on fear and offers the illusion of control in return. This is how power sustains itself, not through justice, but through sacrifice. You've heard Lucie's story, but it's more than a story. It's a mirror, held to the face of every society that claims to value life but trades it for comfort. Now ask yourself, how many times has the truth been buried to preserve the lie? How many more must fall before we see what's really happening? You're not just hearing a case from 1904. You're hearing the operating system of control, coded. Have you ever wondered why some crimes become legends while others fade without a trace? It's not about justice, it's about utility. Lucie Berlin's murder served a function beyond the courtroom. It gave the system an opportunity to remind the public who holds the power to label, to judge, and to bury the truth beneath official narratives. Theodore Berber wasn't a man anymore, he was a tool. His fate didn't hinge on guilt or innocence, it hinged on his usefulness to the agenda of fear management. Fear is the oldest form of control, and nothing cultivates it more potently than the brutal death of a child, amplified across newspapers, whispered in alleyways, twisted into cautionary tales by authorities who feed on your anxiety. Lucie's red boots, her gold medallion, the white basket, they weren't just evidence. They became symbols in a dark ritual. The kind of ritual societies have performed for centuries under different names. Witch trials, public hangings, scapegoats chosen to soak up the dread of the masses. It pacifies you, makes you believe justice exists, but it's not justice, it's theater. Now think, who benefits from that theater? The power structure, the institutions that require your obedience, the machine that demands your fear so it can sell you safety. In Lucie's time, the press printed every gory detail, not to inform but to hook the public's attention, to inflame their terror, and to present the police as saviors when they solved the crime. But they didn't solve anything, they just selected a narrative and imprisoned a man who fit the mold. Whether Berber was truly guilty became irrelevant. His arrest was a public relations triumph. The people demanded blood. The system delivered it, and the cycle continued. It always continues. Look at your world today. Mass media, sensational trials, enemies created overnight. It's the same pattern. Different names, different faces, but always the same outcome. Your compliance, your silence. Lucie's story was buried in time, but the mechanism that consumed her never stopped. You're still living inside it, and now that you know, the question becomes, how much of what you believe is truth and how much is the lie you've been fed since birth? You were never meant to hear this. Not like this. Not with clarity sharp enough to cut through the fog. Lucie Berlin's death was not a one-time event. It was part of a continuum, a cycle of manipulation masked as justice. And the moment you grasp that, the illusion begins to fracture. Look closely. The blood-stained basket, the wool fibers, the river's current carrying secrets beneath the surface, all meticulously examined, all paraded before the public. But none of it truly mattered, because the decision had already been made. Someone had to fall. The machine demands resolution, not truth. It requires an ending, so the masses can return to their routines believing the threat is gone, when in fact the true threat was never the man in the dock. The true threat is the system's cold efficiency in shaping your perception of reality. Understand this. The forensic evidence was flimsy, the eyewitness accounts contradictory, the supposed motive non-existent. Yet Berber was found guilty, not because of proof, but because the narrative needed a villain. He was poor, unliked, marked by a criminal past, easy to vilify, easy to discard. And with his conviction, the system reinforced its image, powerful, just, and unassailable. But that's the mask. Beneath it lies a mechanism of control that's been refined for centuries. Keep the people afraid, give them someone to blame, and they will never turn their eyes upward, never question who benefits from their fear. This is psychological warfare at its most refined. And the greatest weapon? The belief that you are safe, that the authorities have your best interests at heart. They don't. They never did. Lucie's family was a tool, their grief exploited, their pain packaged into headlines. Their loss became a performance. The public devoured it and then forgot. But those who orchestrate these performances never forget. They study the reaction. They refine the script. And they prepare for the next act. You are living inside a script right now. Every fear, every newsflash, every crisis, it's all designed to shape you, mold you, control you. Lucie Berlin was 9 years old when she vanished into the machine. Her body was broken, her memory manipulated, her death turned into a mechanism of power. And now you've stepped into that darkness. They told you it was justice. They paraded the verdict. Headlines blared, faces wept, and the city exhaled, relieved not because truth had triumphed, but because order had been restored. But ask yourself, whose order? And at what cost? The court called it manslaughter. 15 years behind bars for the dismemberment of a child. Does that sound like justice? Or like a deal struck in the shadows? A sentence crafted not to serve truth, but to serve appearances. To keep the public pacified while deeper rot festered. You see, this wasn't about one man or one girl. It was about the machine protecting itself. And the sentence? A signal. A quiet message from the system. We decide what justice means. We define guilt. We control the story. The trial was theater, carefully staged, with witnesses, experts, and testimonies all choreographed to create closure. Not justice, closure. Because closure shuts questions down. It buries doubt beneath finality. But behind the polished words of the judge, behind the pageantry of law, something else moved. An ancient pattern, older than the courtroom, older than the city. The ritual of sacrifice. Throughout history, societies have demanded blood to maintain the illusion of control. From ancient temples to modern courtrooms, a body must be laid upon the altar, not for atonement, but for distraction. The people need to see that someone pays, even if the true orchestrators remain untouched. Lucie's body became that sacrifice. And Theodore Berber, guilty or not, became the vessel for the crowd's rage and fear. His life traded for silence, his name etched into the annals of infamy. But silence is not peace, it is decay. And decay spreads beneath the surface, behind closed doors, within institutions that still perform the same rituals under different names. The travel basket, the fibers, the river, all props in a performance designed to end, not with truth, but with obedience. And you? You are the audience. You were shown a spectacle so you'd never question who built the stage, but now you know, now you see. And knowledge like this, it doesn't fade. It claws at you. It demands action. But first, it demands that you speak. If you're still with me, comment the phrase, "The veil is lifted twice." Once to break free, and once to be seen. The crowd that gathered for Lucie Berlin's funeral wasn't there for justice. They were there for closure. Nearly 1,000 people stood in silence as her small coffin passed by, the marching band's dirge echoing through the streets like a final lullaby. But beneath their mourning, something darker pulsed, an ancient need satisfied, a primal ritual completed. The people didn't realize it, but they had just participated in a public sacrifice. Her death, her broken body, and the spectacle of her burial served a higher purpose, not spiritual, not moral, but psychological. It was about control, about reaffirming the power of the system that governs them. The parade of grief wasn't just for Lucie, it was a performance for the city itself. And behind every tear shed, the machine grew stronger. Because the machine thrives not on truth, but on emotion. It takes your fear, your sorrow, your outrage, and weaponizes it. Converts it into compliance. You don't resist what you're too broken to question. That's the lesson they've taught for centuries. And it worked. The public grieved, then moved on. The authorities proclaimed victory over chaos. The press published their final articles. And Lucie's name, once screamed in every corner of the city, faded into a memory wrapped in sanitized lies. But let's ask the forbidden question. Who really won? The police? No. They were pawns. The court? No. It was a stage. The real winner was the structure. The ancient architecture of power that thrives on ritual, blood, and obedience. This structure has many faces, governments, courts, churches, corporations, but its essence never changes. It consumes innocence and sells you security, and you pay for it with your freedom. Lucie was the price of a temporary peace. Theodore Berber was the offering, and the public's silence was the currency of their submission. If you think this was unique to Berlin in 194, you are still asleep. These rituals happen every day across the world. Some are small, unnoticed, others are massive, televised. But the purpose is the same, to control you through fear and to keep you from seeing who truly holds the knife. This is not history, this is the present. And if you feel something stirring now, unease, anger, clarity, don't ignore it. That's your mind awakening. The trial of Theodore Berber was never about truth. It was about containment, containing the chaos, the public fear, and most of all the truth that no one dared to speak aloud. Nearly 1,000 witnesses were summoned, paraded before a courtroom that was less a place of justice and more a cathedral of control. The newspapers transcribed every word, not for clarity, but for saturation, to drown the public in a deluge of noise, to ensure that within the avalanche of testimony the real questions would vanish. Questions like, who truly orchestrated the narrative? Why was the evidence so circumstantial, yet the sentence so swift? And why did no one question how a man with no definitive link to the murder could be so easily condemned? The answer lies in the nature of power. It doesn't seek truth, it seeks obedience. And fear is its greatest tool. The judge, the jury, the press, all extensions of the same machine that thrives on fear-induced silence. When Theodore stood before the court, he didn't plead for mercy. He compared himself to Christ, accused, condemned, and crucified. A madman's delusion, or a final desperate attempt to expose the ritual he'd been caught in? Think about it. He knew the outcome before the verdict was read. He understood his role, not as a defendant but as a symbol. The crowd demanded blood, and he was chosen to bleed. The law didn't fail. It performed exactly as intended. It provided a narrative, a scapegoat, and a conclusion. But every performance has an audience, and you, watching this now, were never meant to see beyond the script. But you have. You've begun to understand that power sustains itself not through justice but through the illusion of it, through ceremonies disguised as trials, through headlines disguised as truth. Theodore Berber's sentence, 15 years imprisonment, followed by 10 years surveillance, was not justice, it was preservation, PR. Preservation of the system's authority, a message to all who would question it. We decide guilt, we define truth, and we are never wrong. But now you see the cracks. You see how easily the innocent can be erased, how effortlessly a life can be shattered to maintain control. This isn't just history, it's a mirror held to your present. Ask yourself, how many Lucies have vanished? How many Berbers have been offered to the crowd? The ritual continues. Will you keep watching? Let's strip away the courtroom theatrics, the witness testimonies, the carefully staged verdict, and look at what truly remained. A little girl torn apart, physically and symbolically. Her body dismembered, her innocence sacrificed, her story repurposed for the machinery of order. And yet, beneath this horror, lies an even darker truth. Lucie Berlin's death was not the end. It was a beginning. The beginning of a narrative that allowed those in power to reassert their dominance, to remind the masses of their dependency, their vulnerability, their helplessness in the face of evil. This case wasn't merely about one predator, it was about a system showing its hand and daring anyone to challenge it. Consider this, the forensic evidence was weak, the blood on Theodore's clothes was washed out, the fibers could have come from anywhere, the travel basket was common, and still he was condemned. Why? Because the machinery needed resolution. It needed to close the loop to keep the masses docile. They had to believe justice had prevailed. They had to believe that the system worked. But the system doesn't work. It survives. It adapts, manipulates, and consumes. Lucie was consumed. Theodore was consumed. And the public too was consumed, fed a story they needed to believe to sleep at night. This is the mechanism of psychological control, perfected over centuries. Give the people a fear they cannot solve, then offer them a solution they cannot question. Manufacture chaos, then offer order. It's a pattern. Predictable, repeated, effective. And now, over 100 years later, the same playbook is still in use. The only difference? The methods have become more sophisticated, digital, ubiquitous. But the goal remains: obedience. Through fear, through spectacle, through ritual. And here's the uncomfortable truth. By watching, by accepting, we become part of it. Participants in our own subjugation, unless we wake up. Unless we ask, who benefits from this fear? Who gains power from our belief in the system's infallibility? It's time to see the design, to understand that every ritual, ancient or modern, is a tool, a means to control your mind, your emotions, your reality. The Lucie Berlin case was not a tragedy, it was a blueprint. And now, having seen it, you have a choice. Keep descending with me, deeper into the truth. You've come this far, and now the curtain begins to slip, not just on Lucie Berlin's murder, but on the entire structure of how control is crafted, reinforced, and silently accepted. Let's return to that moment. Lucie's mutilated body pulled from the river, wrapped in blood-stained paper, discarded like refuse. What was this if not symbolic? The disposal was not rushed. It was ritualistic. A statement hidden in plain sight. And the basket? An everyday item suddenly transformed into a vessel of death, then conveniently found, its bloodstains and wool fibers pointing just enough to suggest guilt, but never enough to conclusively prove it. This wasn't forensic science, it was theatrical suggestion. Now look closer. This entire investigation was framed to direct your attention toward one man, Theodore Berber. Yet none of the evidence had clarity. No eyewitness placed him with Lucie. His alibi was imperfect, but so was the timeline. His relationship with Johanna Liut, already soaked in vice, was weaponized. He was undesirable, unrespected, easy to discard. He wasn't convicted because he was guilty. He was convicted because he was convenient. Understand this. In every era, power seeks not just order, but optics. The illusion of safety must be stronger than actual justice. To preserve belief in the system, a sacrifice must be made. And in 1904, Berlin, Theodore Berber was selected. But here's what they don't want you to realize. This selection process, this manipulation of public fear, is part of a much older design, one that stretches back to ancient times when kings ruled by divine right and kept order through blood rituals and public executions. The mechanisms are the same, only the costumes have changed. The robes are now suits, the gallows are now courtrooms, the scrolls are now newspapers, but the power remains, ancient, concealed, and always hungry for belief. Your belief. Because see, belief fuels the system. It gives life to its lies. And when you start to doubt, when you begin to see through the performance, that's when you become dangerous. That's when you begin to awaken. So I ask you now, do you see it? The system that fed on Lucie's innocence. The same one that feeds on your obedience. If you do, type "eyes unveiled" twice in the comments. Lock it in. Mark this moment. Because identity begins with a The phrase, "eyes unveiled," is more than symbolic. It's a declaration of war, not against flesh and blood, but against the invisible architecture that cages the mind. The Lucie Berlin case was a test of this architecture, a perfect case study in how fear and tragedy are converted into power and compliance. Now let's follow the blood trail deeper. Consider the timing. Just 2 days after Lucie vanished, a fisherman discovers her torso wrapped carefully in stained paper. Days later, more body parts emerge, each discovery spaced just enough to prolong the panic, to stretch the fear. Why? Because fear is currency, and whoever controls its flow controls perception. The police fed this fear to the public, one gruesome revelation at a time. The press amplified it, saturating every street with whispers of terror, ensuring that no one questioned, only reacted. This is not a one-off incident. This is psychological conditioning, controlled releases of horror to corral the masses, to make them beg for order, for protection. And then enter the system, the savior, ready with its verdict, its punishment, its message: trust us, or be next. But even that is surface level. Beneath it lies the ancient core, blood sacrifice. Not in the primitive, overt sense, but symbolically refined. Lucie's death became a communal ritual, her mutilation the centerpiece of a fear-based religion where the state is God, the courtroom its altar, and public faith its lifeblood. Ask yourself, why was the evidence against Theodore Berber so thin, yet so aggressively pursued? Because the power system needed closure, not truth. It needed obedience restored. Theodore wasn't punished for what he did. He was punished to teach. He was the scapegoat, a concept as old as civilization itself, where society casts out one to cleanse the guilt of all, and the public, desperate to believe, accepted the offering. No protest, no rebellion, only relief. But that relief comes at a cost, the cost of truth, of freedom, of awareness, and that cost is paid every time we accept the official story without question. Lucie's death wasn't just tragic. It was instructive, a message encoded in blood. Stay asleep, stay afraid, stay obedient. But you're not here to obey, you're here to awaken, and we're only just beginning to unearth. You've seen the facade, now let's open the crypt beneath it. Lucie's murder was horrific, yes, but the rituals surrounding her death reveal something far more sinister, a convergence of ancient psychological control mechanisms refined through modern institutions. Think of the courtroom where Theodore Berber stood. That wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a ceremonial cleansing. The public had been contaminated by fear, destabilized by the horror of a child's dismemberment. They needed resolution. They needed a sacrifice. And in true ritualistic form, the state provided one. But behind this performance is a deeper pattern: problem, reaction, solution. This trinity is the engine of control. First, unleash chaos, a problem no one expects. Then provoke a reaction, raw, emotional, desperate. Finally, present a solution, pre-packaged, authoritative, unchallengeable. Lucie's death was the problem. The city's panic was the reaction. Theodore's conviction was the solution. And with that, the cycle completed. The masses, fed and pacified, returned to their routines. never questioning how precisely the pieces fell into place. But here's what they couldn't see. What you now must. This isn't a one-time event. It's a replicating system, a blueprint of manipulation repeated across time and culture. Every major historical shift, every societal trauma, every so-called random tragedy, they all bear the fingerprint of engineered control. Whether it's the burning of Rome, the Black Death scapegoats, or modern-day terror, the mechanics remain unchanged. Fear breeds obedience, and obedience is power, transferred not to the people but from them, extracted like blood from a ritual offering. Lucie's blood was not spilled by one man alone. It was spilled by the system, dripped into the soil of history to grow the roots of submission. And what of the father, Frederick Berlin? His suffering became spectacle, his grief paraded to cement the narrative, to humanize the fear, to ensure the public's emotional investment. But his pain served a purpose, just as yours does when you let fear rule your perception. This is the true cost of unawareness. A life lived within someone else's narrative. But there's a choice. You've already made the first step, seeing the pattern. Now the descent goes deeper, into realms where truth is not given but seized, and in these shadows power awaits. Lucie's story was far from over when Theodore Berber was named the suspect. It was only entering its most twisted chapter. In the public eye, he was now the villain, the face of unspeakable horror. But the truth, as always, is not what it seems. Theodore's arrest was swift, almost too swift. Witness accounts suddenly multiplied. Details about his behavior that no one had thought important before became crucial now. This isn't uncommon. It's how a narrative is sculpted. Fear makes people remember things that may never have happened. But why him? Why Theodore Berber, a man with a shady past? Yes, but far from a solitary monster lurking in the dark. He was easy, an outcast, a criminal, a man who already lived in society's shadow, perfect for blame. But evidence? It was flimsy. Blood on his clothes, too, washed out to confirm, a missing basket that reappeared with fibers and blood, but no eyewitness to place it in his hands. Still, the trial moved forward like a machine already set in motion. Hundreds testified, yet no one could say with certainty they saw him with Lucie. Think about that, no one. But certainty was never the goal, closure was. The public, whipped into a frenzy by the press, needed this. They needed to believe their children were safe again. That the monster had a name and a face. The state delivered. But behind the spectacle there were unanswered questions. Who was the man seen leading a child by the hand near Humboldtine Park? Witnesses described him limping, wearing a straw hat, not Theodore's profile. And what of Johanna Libbert, the prostitute Berber lived with? Her story shifted, her loyalty cracked under pressure, yet she was left untouched. Useful perhaps, controlled perhaps. This wasn't just about a murder. It was about control of perception, management of fear, and the elimination of variables that couldn't be monitored. The city of Berlin, pulsing within, industry, power and corruption, needed a narrative that restored order, and Lucie, even in death, was forced into a role, a tool in a greater game. Her dismembered body wasn't just the result of one man's depravity. It was a symbol, a warning, and a message to the masses. Chaos can touch anyone, but the system will protect you. If you obey, if you trust, if you never ask the wrong questions. But you... As Theodore Berber sat in custody, proclaiming his innocence, the city outside demanded justice. But justice in this case wore a mask, one shaped by fear, pressure, and the invisible hand of those who controlled the narrative. Investigators needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed a scene, a location, a place where Lucie's final moments could be imagined by the public. Something visceral, something that would make people feel the horror and, in turn, accept whatever punishment was handed down. That's when attention turned back to Johanna Libbert's apartment. The police, under immense scrutiny, began a forensic sweep of the small, dingy room she shared with Theodore. It was a place of survival and secrets, stained by years of desperation, but now it became a focal point of official obsession. Chemists scoured it. Floorboards pried up, knives examined, drains dismantled. And what did they find? Almost nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing to tie Lucie to that space. Yet the basket, the one Johanna claimed was missing, was pulled from the river days later, bloodied, stained, lined with wool fibers. And those fibers? They matched Lucie's clothing. That was enough. The basket became the altar upon which truth was sacrificed for resolution. But pause here. Think critically. If Lucie had died in that apartment, where was the blood? Where was the noise? The struggle? Tenement walls are thin. Neighbors are always watching, listening. Yet no one reported hearing screams. No one saw her enter that room. And Theodore's alibi, though flimsy, placed him asleep during the critical window. Still, the basket connected him. But evidence can be planted, stories can be shaped, and fear silences doubt. Lucie's father, crushed by grief, stood before his daughter's remains and recognized a scar, small beneath the ribs. That detail alone shattered him, but for the authorities, it was gold, an emotional anchor, a moment they could use to reinforce the reality they were building. Grief turned public is a powerful weapon. It stifles skepticism. And with the basket, the fibers, and the father's tears, the state had enough. The trial date was set. The machine was in motion. And Lucie's death, her mutilated body, became the symbol of everything the public feared, and everything the state promised to defeat. But remember this, real power doesn't rest in truth. It thrives in perception, and this was crafted perception. The trial of Theodore Berber was not just a courtroom drama, it was a stage, and every element had been carefully arranged. From the grieving parents to the blood-speckled basket, to the parade of witnesses whose memories grew sharper with every passing day, this wasn't just justice being served, it was order being restored through performance. December 12, 1904, inside the packed courtroom, 1,000 eyes bore down on the accused. Reporters, hungry for spectacle, scribbled every word, every gesture, feeding a public that had already decided Berber's guilt. And Berber? He stood not like a broken man, but defiant. He compared himself to Christ before Pontius Pilate, an audacious statement, yet one that hinted at his belief in a trial not just unfair, but predetermined. And maybe he wasn't wrong. One by one, witnesses testified. Some recalled seeing him near Lucie's building, others remembered odd behaviors, but none, not one, had seen him with Lucie that day. No one could place him at the scene. And yet, the basket remained the centerpiece. The prosecution leaned on it heavily, the blood traces, the wool fibers. Their expert claimed the fibers matched Lucie's dress. The blood was human. And the basket? Johanna said it was hers, gone on the day of the crime. But the defense struck back. They argued that the basket was common, hundreds like it in Berlin's markets. That the blood was too degraded to link, that no forensic science could place Lucie inside that apartment. Still, the court didn't need proof beyond doubt. It needed closure. The city, on edge, demanded it. Theodore's life, reputation, and freedom now hung on threads woven not of truth but of need. The need to believe that the killer was caught, that the nightmare was over. But as the trial moved forward, something darker began to stir beneath the surface. Questions arose. Not about the murder, but about why this case mattered so much. Why were officials so desperate for resolution? What did Lucie's death really represent? It was more than a crime. It was a signal, a ritual almost, a child lost, a body dismembered, a city terrified, and from that fear, power consolidated, control reasserted. Every trial has a verdict, but only some carry a shadow that never lifts. This one? As the trial advanced, the prosecution unleashed its final weapon, emotional gravity. Lucie's mother, fragile and hollow-eyed, was called to the stand. The courtroom fell silent, breathless. Her voice trembled as she recounted Lucie's last words, spoken just hours before her disappearance. "I'm not stupid, Mother. No one will cut off my head and throw it into the water." That sentence didn't just echo, it detonated. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Headlines the next morning emblazoned those words, weaponizing the child's innocent confidence into a symbol of lost safety, lost innocence. It was no longer just about Theodore Berber. It was about them, the audience, the families reading their newspapers with trembling hands, wondering if their children might be next. The mother's testimony was a dagger, and it landed deep. But beyond the emotional spectacle, the prosecution still struggled. No eyewitness, no murder weapon, no blood in the apartment. Only the basket, the fibers, the blood traces, and the sense that something monstrous had happened. For the prosecution, that sense was enough. The defense attacked the evidence again. Their own experts argued the blood couldn't be conclusively identified. They called the fiber analysis flawed. They pointed out that the travel basket's design was common, that the entire case rested on assumptions and pressure to convict. But the room didn't want reason. They wanted retribution. And Berber's defiance didn't help. He refused to break, to beg, to cower. That made him dangerous in their eyes. A guilty man should be broken, they thought, and because he wasn't, they decided he must be hiding something. Behind closed doors, jurors whispered. Reporters framed every courtroom moment as a descent into madness. And outside, Berlin waited with torches in hand. Not literal ones, but the kind of torches born from fear, from rage, from the need to see blood balance blood. And here's where the story darkens further, not because of what Theodore Berber did, but because of what this trial revealed about the system itself. The system didn't want truth. It wanted obedience. It wanted to remind the masses, obey the rules, or suffer like Berber. And Lucie's death? That was the currency. Her tragedy bought them control. As you hear this, ask yourself, how often has your fear been used this way? How often has your grief been weaponized for someone else's power? This story. When the jury finally left the courtroom to deliberate, they weren't weighing facts, they were silencing unrest. Behind those closed doors, with the eyes of Berlin pressing in from every street corner and newsstand, they didn't ask, did Theodore Berber kill Lucie Berlin? They asked, what happens if we say he didn't? And in that question lies the heart of this case. Within an hour, they returned. Their verdict, guilty, but not of murder, of manslaughter. A subtle distinction perhaps, but one that cloaked the trial in ambiguity. Manslaughter implied chaos, not cold calculation, but it still sealed Berber's fate. The judge, stern and unmoved, sentenced him to 15 years in prison, followed by 10 more under strict supervision. It wasn't just punishment, it was exile, erasure, transformation of a man into a cautionary tale. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the trial was over. But what about Lucie? What about justice? Theodore Berber's conviction raised more questions than it answered. No motive was ever uncovered. No weapon was ever found. The dismemberment? Still unexplained. And Johanna, the woman whose basket carried the child's remains, was never charged, never convicted. She vanished into obscurity, her name fading from the headlines like fog in the morning light. Meanwhile, Berlin moved on. It had to. The public needed closure, needed the illusion that evil had been confronted and defeated. But for those who looked closer, who weren't blinded by the parade of grief and punishment, an unsettling truth remained. Nothing added up. The evidence didn't convict. The fear did. The need for a scapegoat, for a symbol. Lucie became that symbol, a small, innocent girl consumed by the machinery of crime, power, and social control. Her death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a tool, used to reinforce order, to remind the public of the invisible lines they must never cross. This is the horror they don't teach in schools, don't print in textbooks. The horror that power feeds on tragedy, that institutions manipulate fear to cement their grip on the masses. And when that fear fades, they find another victim, another crime, another sacrifice to feed the system. Lucie Berlin's story didn't end with a verdict. It echoes still in every courtroom where truth is traded for control. Theodore Berber was led from the courtroom in shackles, not with the screams of guilt echoing behind him, but with a chilling silence, a silence heavy with uncertainty. The press framed it as justice served, but those who had watched every moment knew differently. Something didn't feel right. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered, waiting not for truth but for closure. They didn't care if he was guilty. They needed someone to blame, someone to punish, and Berber, with his criminal past and cold demeanor, was the perfect candidate. But inside his prison cell, the truth began to rot like an open wound. Theodore never confessed, not once. Instead, he maintained that he had been asleep the entire time, that he'd woken to find himself in a nightmare designed for someone else's convenience. And then there was the matter of Johanna, the travel basket, the apartment, the timeline. It all pointed to her as well. But the system didn't pursue her, didn't want to. Her involvement would complicate the story, muddy the waters. They needed a lone wolf, not a conspiracy. So she disappeared from public view, allowed to slip into anonymity while Berber bore the full weight of the crime. And here lies a deeper question. Was Johanna a pawn or a player? Was she coerced, or was she complicit in ways we'll never fully understand? The records don't say, they simply stop. And that's the most disturbing part, how history stops where it becomes dangerous. What happened to the forensic evidence that couldn't be tested properly? What about the lack of blood in the apartment, the inconsistencies in witness testimonies? All of it vanished beneath the heavy curtain of conviction, because once the story was decided, nothing else mattered. And as Berber served his sentence, the city moved on, its appetite for scandal temporarily satisfied. But beneath the surface, fear lingered. Families locked their doors tighter, children were kept closer, and the authorities, those who orchestrated the narrative, watched as society adjusted, as people became more obedient, more afraid. That was the true power of Lucie Berlin's case. Not in the courtroom, but in the minds of the masses. A lesson had been taught. Stray from the line, question the order, and the machinery will find you, grind you down, and bury you beneath the weight of someone else's justice. In the years that followed, Lucie Berlin's name faded from public memory, but not from the minds of those who had truly seen what unfolded. The deeper one looks into the records, the more gaps emerge. Pages missing from files, witness accounts abruptly halted, forensic notes redacted. What was being hidden? And why? This wasn't just incompetence, it was intentional. The court claimed it had delivered justice, yet it left behind a trail of unanswered questions that whispered of something more sinister. Consider this. The police were under immense public pressure to solve the case quickly. The city was gripped by fear, and fear demands resolution, not truth. In this crucible of panic, Theodore Berber became the sacrifice, the offering to restore the illusion of control. But there was no evidence. No witness ever saw him with Lucie. No murder weapon was ever found, and the forensic tests could not confirm whose blood stained the basket. Yet none of this mattered. The machine had chosen its target. Johanna, the one person whose possessions held Lucie's remains, walked free. Why? Who protected her? Was she useful? Or perhaps she knew too much? There were whispers, later hushed, that Johanna had ties to figures in Berlin's underworld, men who moved between shadow and power, untouchable, unseen. Could Lucie have been a casualty of something larger, something that reached beyond a simple murder? A warning to someone, a ritual of control? These are the forbidden questions. And then there's the child herself. Lucie, described as polite, obedient, a bright soul in a dark world. She was the ideal victim, not just because of her innocence, but because of what her death could achieve. The city's attention was diverted, the people's anger directed, and their fear molded into obedience. The message was clear: you are not safe, and only the state can protect you. But who will protect you from the state? Lucie's body was never buried whole, pieces of her found days apart, wrapped in paper, drifting down the spree like secrets waiting to surface. Her head, her limbs, her small torso, delivered back to a public desperate for closure. But there is no closure in this story, only layers of darkness and control, and beneath it all, a question that refuses to. The final days of the trial weren't about truth, they were theater. The crowd inside that courtroom didn't seek justice, they sought catharsis, a purging of collective fear through spectacle. And the judge, the prosecutors, the press, they delivered it. Lucie Berlin's death became a stage on which power was exercised and submission demanded. Remember this: nearly 1,000 witnesses were called to testify. That's not investigation. It's overkill. It's distraction. It's drowning the truth beneath a flood of noise. Among those voices were key testimonies lost in the tide. Witnesses who contradicted each other, who saw men with beards, others with no beard, children claiming different clothing, different times. These discrepancies were noted, then buried, because a narrative had to be maintained. Theodore Berber was compared to Christ himself, not by the public, but by him, and the press devoured it. His words were twisted to imply madness, delusion, guilt. But was he truly mad? Or was he aware? Did he realize the machine needed a villain and that he'd been chosen? His cries in the courtroom, unreported in official transcripts, spoke of betrayal, of being used, of lies. Yet the focus remained fixed. Lucie's mother, her grief, her final conversation with her daughter, when Lucie said, "No one will cut off my head and throw it into the water." That line was repeated endlessly in newspapers, whispered on the streets. It was haunting, yes, but it also controlled the narrative. It burned the horror into public memory, ensuring that fear would linger long after the trial, and fear is power. Meanwhile, Theodore's sentence, 15 years, was presented as leniency, but the added 10 years of surveillance, that was a leash, a signal to anyone else who might resist, might question, might seek to expose the deeper rot beneath Berlin's surface. Johanna disappeared. The basket vanished from return. Cords, and the forensic experts who testified, some were later dismissed, others silenced. Their findings, partial, inconclusive, dangerous to the official version. The Spree River, once a place of commerce and life, became a symbol of death, of things lost and never recovered. And Lucie? Her memory became a cautionary tale, not to protect the children, but to control the parents, keep them afraid, keep them obedient, keep them silent. And beneath it all, the truth lies like. But not all were silent. In the years following Lucie Berlin's death, a handful of journalists and private investigators, men operating on the fringes of acceptability, began asking the wrong questions. They revisited the tenement on Aosta Street, speaking to those who still lived in the decaying building, and what they found only deepened the shadows around Lucie's murder. Several elderly residents spoke of an argument overheard days before Lucie disappeared, raised voices between Johanna and an unknown man. Not Theodore Berber, someone else, someone described as well-dressed, authoritative, with the cadence of a man used to commanding obedience. His name? Never learned. But one resident claimed he returned to the building the very day Lucie vanished, slipping in through the back stairwell, seen only for a moment before disappearing into Johanna's apartment. When these accounts were quietly passed to the authorities, there was no follow-up, no record. The files simply vanished. And yet the whispers remained. Lucie was not a random victim, they said. Her death was not simply the act of a depraved man. It was calculated, methodical, a message. But to whom? Her father, Friedrich Berlin, had connections to a local labor union, an organization that had begun pushing for greater rights, challenging powerful industrialists tied directly to the German elite. It was rumored that Friedrich had been warned, keep quiet, keep your head down. After Lucie's death, he did just that. He vanished from the movement, from public life, reduced to a broken man, silent and hollow. Was Lucie's death retaliation? A warning delivered in blood? The evidence, though circumstantial, forms a pattern, one not of madness or chaos, but of control. And here's the final chilling twist. A single photograph, long buried in an archive, was uncovered by one of those rogue investigators. It shows a group of men, Thai officials, police, businessmen, posing at a social event. In the background, partially obscured, stands Johanna Lute, smiling faintly, her eyes cold. Standing beside her, hand resting on her shoulder, is the unknown man from the testimonies, the one no one ever questioned, the one who walked freely while Theodore Berber rotted in prison. Who was he? His name, his role, all remain hidden. But his presence in that photo tells you one thing. That photograph was more than a relic. It was a key, a silent witness to the web of influence behind Lucie Berlin's murder. The man standing beside Johanna Lute bore a pin on his lapel, barely visible, an insignia linked not to the city but to a private fraternal order operating in Berlin's highest circles. This order, known for its secrecy, was involved in industrial ventures, law enforcement, and quietly, politics. They had their hands in the booming steel and chemical industries that fueled Germany's rise, and they operated with near total impunity. When that photo surfaced, attempts to trace it led nowhere. The archive where it was found was suddenly closed to the public, citing reorganization. The journalist who uncovered it? He vanished from the records shortly after publishing a vague article which was quietly pulled from circulation within days, but before he disappeared he left behind a cryptic note. The truth about Lucie Berlin was never meant to be told. They needed a sacrifice, not for religion, not for crime, but for order. This phrase, for order, echoed in hidden documents, in the private correspondence between Berlin city officials during that era. The fear was never about crime, it was about chaos, about what would happen if the working poor rose, if the balance tipped. Lucie's death, some believe, was used to enforce silence, to stoke fear within communities that were organizing, speaking out. Her mutilation, horrific, unforgettable, was not random. It was symbolic, a message to those who dared defy the hierarchy. Theodore Berber, with his criminal record, was the perfect scapegoat, disposable, disliked, and easy to convict. And Johanna? She walked away. After the trial, she vanished. But in the following years, sightings of her emerged in different cities, Leipzig, Munich, Vienna, always under different names, always tied to similar circles of underground. Establishments quietly protected, never prosecuted. One theory suggests she was rewarded for her role, allowed to escape, her silence bought with anonymity and safety. The real question isn't who killed Lucie, it's why Lucie had to die. Her story is a shadow, cast not by one man's madness, but by a system's need for control. And in that darkness, we see a truth few dare acknowledge. Sometimes, evil is not chaotic. In the years after Lucie Berlin's death, the case was closed, the city moved on, and history forgot. But buried in forgotten records, faded testimonies, and suppressed reports lies a truth that still breathes, a truth more unsettling than any courtroom verdict. Theodore Berber served 15 years in prison for manslaughter, his name etched into public memory as a villain. Yet there was no direct evidence, no blood found in the apartment, no eyewitness placing him with Lucie at the moment of her disappearance. What there was fear. Fear among the witnesses, fear among the investigators. Records show that one key witness, a neighbor who had reported seeing a man matching the mysterious figure's description near the Berlin family's door, was later arrested on unrelated charges and disappeared from public view. His name never surfaced again in connection to the case. Even more unsettling, the judge who presided over the trial, known for his leniency in other cases, pushed for the maximum sentence possible under law. Not for justice, but for closure. The city needed a resolution. The public needed a villain, and the powerful needed silence. But traces of the truth kept seeping through. In 1910, 6 years later, another child went missing in a nearby district under eerily similar circumstances. Again, there was mention of a man with a limp, a beard, and a straw hat. Again, the trail went cold. No arrests, no answers. And those who tried to connect the dots? Silenced. Files destroyed. Reporters reassigned or dismissed. Lucie's death was not an isolated act. It was part of a pattern, a ritualized system of fear and control masked by poverty, masked by crime, but orchestrated from above. Her small red ankle boots, the last known detail of her vibrant life, became a symbol among the few who remembered, a symbol of innocence consumed by a machine that needed victims to maintain order. Her father died in obscurity. Her family was broken, scattered, and those truly responsible. They remained untouched, hidden behind walls of influence, protected by time and silence. But now we remember. Now we speak her name. Lucie Berlin. Not just a victim, but a symbol. A signal flare from history's darkest corner, warning us that sometimes the greatest horrors are not committed in shadow, but in full view, masked by law, masked by power. Truth isn't lost. It's buried. Waiting. If you've made it this far, you already know. This isn't just a story. It's a revelation, one that was never meant to be heard, and now you've heard it. The horrifying case of Lucie Berlin is just one shard of the mirror, a mirror that reflects not only the past, but the forces still at work beneath our so-called civilized world. If this truth struck you, if it opened your eyes, then step deeper into the unknown with us. Like, share, and subscribe to History's Dark Mirror, where forbidden stories rise from the shadows and lost voices are finally heard. Share this video with someone who's ready to see through the lies. And comment below. The mirror never lies. Not once, but twice. Once for the truth, once for transformation.